There's something I want to look at with a steady lens, not as a warning and not as a lesson, just as a pattern I've been catching in myself and in the world around me. No agreement needed, no performance required, just a quiet look at what happens when a thought feels good too quickly. Because I don't think most people get pulled into false certainty because they're careless. I think they get pulled in because they're carrying pressure, and pressure wants a direction. I've been paying attention to how often people form convictions without ever building them. Not in an obvious way. Not like someone wakes up and says, "I'm going to outsource my mind today." It happens with something smaller. A moment, a fragment, a single sentence that hits at the right time. A quote, a clip, screenshot, a headline, a caption sitting over footage that has nothing to do with the claim being made. And what's strange is how quickly one piece can become a whole identity. Not because the piece is complete, but because it's usable. Fragments are powerful because they let you hold something without understanding it. They don't require context. They don't demand patience. They don't ask you to tolerate contradiction long enough for clarity to form. They let you take one piece and call it the truth. And once you can do that, you can justify almost anything, because you can point to the fragment and say, "Look, it's right there." That gesture feels like evidence. Even if you don't know what surrounds it, even if you never read what came before or after, even if you couldn't explain the full idea in your own words to save your life. That fragment gives you something to show. And for a lot of people, that's enough. Not enough to become clear, enough to become confident. And the difference between those two matters more than most people realize, because confidence travels. Clarity doesn't. Clarity moves slowly. It needs revision. And clarity has to live through questions. Confidence can be packaged. It can be repeated without strain. Once a person learns how to collect confident fragments, they start to feel like they've built something internal, when what they've really built is a stack of borrowed conclusions. A lot of people treat misinformation like a knowledge issue. Like the main problem is that people don't have the right facts. But I don't think this begins with missing information. I think it begins with something more physical. Pressure. Emotional pressure that sits underneath the surface of everyday life. Not always anger. Sometimes disappointment, shame, loneliness. Sometimes it's that strange numbness that makes you feel like you're watching your own life from a few feet behind your eyes. Pressure builds when something inside you doesn't have room to move. When you don't have language for what you're carrying. When you don't know how to express it cleanly. When you don't want to admit it's there. And when pressure sits in someone long enough, it looks for somewhere to go. That isn't a flaw. That's a mechanism. If you don't give your inner world a place to process, it will accept an outer target. Not because the target is accurate, but because it is available. So a fragment shows up that says, "This is why." And your body responds before your mind does. Because finally, there's a handle. Finally, there's a direction. Finally, the pressure in your chest isn't floating anymore. It has somewhere to land. That's what makes borrowed certainty so seductive. It doesn't only answer questions. Sometimes it rescues you from discomfort. It gives the pressure an explanation. And once that pressure has an explanation, it feels like it has meaning. That feels stabilizing, and it feels like control, even if nothing has been understood. This is where people get confused about what it means to think for yourself. Because it's easy to assume that if you believe something, you must have thought your way into it. But beliefs aren't always built. Some beliefs are adopted. Some are inherited. Some are absorbed. And absorption doesn't require intent. You don't have to go searching. You just have to be around the right environment long enough. That's why certain ideas spread like wildfire. They don't spread because everyone investigated and reached the same conclusion. They spread because they arrive prepackaged. They arrive with certainty built into them. They arrive with emotional direction already attached. And direction feels like relief when you've been drifting. People underestimate what relief does to the mind. Relief makes you stop questioning. It makes you stop digging. Relief makes you stop looking for deeper structure because the emotional problem feels solved. And when the emotional problem feels solved, the intellectual part of you goes quiet. Not because you're incapable, because you're tired. And tired minds accept things they would question if they were rested. I know because I've done that. Not with some extreme ideology, with smaller things. A judgment, a reaction, a conclusion about someone else. A belief about how the world works that I absorbed because it matched the mood I was in. Not because it was true, because it was satisfying. And once something becomes satisfying, your mind starts protecting it. Not logically, but emotionally. That's the part I think people miss. They assume the reason someone defends a belief is because they studied it. But a lot of belief defense has nothing to do with study. People defend ideas because the ideas are load-bearing. They're holding something up. They're holding pressure off the chest. They're holding confusion away. They're holding pain in a place where it doesn't have to be faced directly. So when someone challenges the idea, what the person feels isn't disagreement. They feel destabilization. Because if the idea collapses, the pressure returns. And the pressure returning feels like drowning. So instead of investigating, they double down. Not because they're evil, because they're protecting relief. And relief is one of the most addictive things a human can feel. Not relief as comfort, relief as escape. Relief as a sudden absence of internal weight. That kind of relief doesn't feel like a temporary emotion. It feels like a life raft. So people cling to it. And once they cling to it, they start building identity around it. This is where repetition becomes dangerous. Because repetition doesn't just spread information. Repetition forms posture. You repeat something enough times, and eventually it stops sounding like an opinion, and it starts sounding like you. That's how people get possessed by ideas without realizing it. Not possessed in a dramatic way, but in a gradual way. They adopt the phrasing, the tone, the confidence, the contempt. They start using language that isn't theirs, not because they're pretending, but because they've been around it so long that it feels like their native tongue now. That's what happens when an environment speaks louder than your inner world. And at some point, you stop being able to tell the difference between a thought you explored and a thought you borrowed and repeated until it felt familiar. Familiarity can masquerade as truth. That's another trap. People trust what feels familiar. They call it intuition. But intuition is only reliable when your internal world is clear. When your internal world is full of pressure and noise, intuition gets hijacked by whatever has been repeated the most. That's why it feels right isn't always guidance. Sometimes it's just conditioning. Short-form content makes this worse in a way most people don't want to admit. Not because it's evil, not because every creator is malicious, but because it removes time. And without time, there's no digestion. There's no room for contradiction to sit next to itself. There's no space for your mind to do what it was built to do, to test, compare, and revise. It's just stimulus after stimulus after stimulus. 7 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, just enough time to inject a conclusion, not enough time to develop one. It trains the mind to accept complete thoughts without participating in them. And the more you consume like that, the more the mind starts accepting that kind of delivery. It's quick, it's clean, finished. So when you encounter real complexity, real life complexity, it feels unbearable because life doesn't come as a clip. It comes unfinished. It comes with missing pieces, and it comes with contradiction. And if your mind is trained on prepackaged certainty, unfinished reality starts to feel like a threat. That's when people start reaching for fragments again. Not because they want truth, because they want relief from the friction of not knowing. There's something else fragments do that's even more subtle. They create the illusion of investigation. Because people feel like they've done the work when they've consumed a lot. They feel informed because they've collected quantity. But collection isn't comprehension. Watching 10 clips about a topic doesn't mean you understand the topic. It means you've seen 10 clips. And if all 10 clips point in the same emotional direction, you're not learning, you're being shaped. That shaping is slow enough that it feels like your choice. That's the genius of it. It doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like preference. And preference feels like freedom. But preference can be engineered. And when preference is engineered, you don't feel controlled. You feel validated. You feel like the world finally agrees with you. That's why this is dangerous. Not because it creates disagreement, because it creates identity reinforcement. It takes whatever emotion you're carrying and gives it an echo chamber. And the echo chamber doesn't just reflect your emotion back. It sharpens it. It strengthens it. It gives it language and confidence and a tribe. So now the emotion isn't just yours. It's part of something. It belongs. And belonging feels like safety, even if the thing you belong to is built on fragments. This is where I want to be careful. Because when people hear this kind of conversation, they assume it means the goal is to never listen to anyone. That's not what I mean. Humans are built to learn from other humans. We model, we imitate, we absorb. That's part of the deal. Thinking for yourself doesn't mean you reject influence. It means you don't let influence replace your process. You can listen, you can consider, you can even agree. But there's a difference between learning from someone and disappearing inside their certainty. That's the line. And the line is hard to see because borrowed certainty feels calm. It feels settled. It feels like the kind of confidence you wish you had. But confidence that arrives too quickly often comes at a cost. It costs your flexibility. It costs your ability to revise without collapsing. It costs your willingness to sit in a question long enough for your mind to actually earn the answer. Because real understanding isn't immediate. Real understanding has texture. It has scars. It has moments where you had to admit you didn't know what you thought. And borrowed certainty skips that entire process. It hands you the finish line without the miles. So you get the posture of certainty without the structure underneath it. That's why it breaks so easily. And that's why people defend it so aggressively. Because if the posture collapses, there's nothing underneath, just pressure again. This is also why arguing rarely works. Not because arguments are always wrong, but because people aren't holding their belief like a theory. They're holding it like a shield. So when you attack a shield, you don't get the truth. You get defense. And defense doesn't listen. Defense reacts. Defense protects. If you want someone to think again, you can't just rip the shield away. You have to make thinking feel safe enough to return to. You have to make slowness acceptable again. You have to make uncertainty something a person can tolerate without feeling weak. Because right now, uncertainty is treated like incompetence. Hesitation gets mocked, and subtlety gets ignored. And that social pressure pushes people towards certainty even faster. It teaches them that being loud is being smart, that having a position is being valuable, that being unsure is being behind. So people fake finish lines. They adopt confidence they haven't earned yet just to survive the room. And the longer they do that, the more that performance becomes identity. From where I stand, the real trap isn't believing something false. The trap is letting your mind get trained into accepting thoughts without earning them. Because once accepting becomes a habit, thinking becomes optional. And when thinking becomes optional, whatever you're exposed to the most starts becoming your default. Not because you chose it consciously, because your mind adapted to it. Adaptation is neutral. Your brain doesn't care whether the environment is healthy. It cares whether the environment is consistent. So if your environment delivers fragments all day long, your mind becomes a fragment mind. Quick conclusions, quick reactions, quick certainty. And when that becomes your default, you lose something you don't realize you lost. You lose your ability to stay present long enough to build your own thought. You lose your ability to hold pressure without assigning it somewhere. You lose your ability to sit with discomfort without converting it into belief. That's what I mean by borrowed certainty. Not that you were influenced, because influence is human. Borrowed certainty is when relief makes the decision for you. When emotional stabilization replaces intellectual honesty. When the speed of a conclusion becomes more important than the depth of your understanding. So what does thinking for yourself actually require? Time. Not a retreat into isolation, not some dramatic transformation, just time. Time to let a thought stay unfinished without rushing to seal it. Time to feel pressure without needing it to become an ideology. Time to let a belief earn its place inside you. Because your mind matters. Your direction matters. And your life will move in the direction of the thoughts you allow to settle inside you, whether you built them or not. So here's the question. If the fragments disappeared tomorrow, the clips, the quotes, the screenshots, the one-liners you've been leaning on, would you still know what you believe? Or would you only know what you've been repeating?